Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Professor Landis, the somnolescent, for bringing us here. It's great to finally meet a lot of people who I've only known through Twitter or through their more scholarly work, or if they're doing scholarly work on Twitter, then the same thing. I'm also grateful because I wrote a 50-page report for the Brookings Institution on the ideology of the Islamic State, and if you looked at it and you made it all the way through, you might notice that I never mentioned the apocalypse. I never mentioned eschatology or the end of the world, and so by being here, I hope in part to make amends for that omission, and in part also maybe to account for and justify it by explaining to you what I think is the role that apocalypticism plays in ISIS's ideology. And but to do that, what I propose to do is offer a comparison with another apocalyptic movement which happened 35 years ago, whose legacy still exerts quite a great deal of influence today, especially ideologically over Sunni jihadism or jihadi Salafism. This is, of course, the movement that took control of the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979 for 2 weeks, believing that it was ushering in the apocalypse. And it was a Saudi movement led by a Saudi man named Juhayman al-Utaybi. It was called, in Arabic, this is the movement, it was called al-Jama'a al-Salafiyya al-Muhtasiba, meaning the Salafi movement that commands right and forbids wrong. And I might call it JSM from here on because there isn't really a good translation otherwise. We tend not to hear a whole lot about this movement today, but my take is that in fact it is tremendously significant, particularly when we're talking about jihadism and apocalypse. So the gist of what I'll be arguing is essentially this, that the 1979 movement, this is Juhayman's movement, is what could be called an apocalypse now movement. It believed that the apocalypse was happening now, that it was initiating a series of apocalyptic events that will culminate in the imminent end of the world, which they perceive to be only some decades away. ISIS, on the other hand, is what could be called a Caliphate now movement. It believes that the Caliphate is happening now. This is the Caliphate that is prophesied to return before the onset of this apocalyptic narrative. But in contrast with Juhayman's movement, ISIS is much vaguer about exactly where it stands with respect to this apocalyptic narrative, as I'll explain more toward the end. Also important is that Juhayman's group, JSM, and ISIS, they share the same theological background, that is Salafism or Wahhabism, which is also the religious ideology of Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, they subscribe to the same apocalyptic narrative, at least broadly conceived, and they draw on the same prophetic sources, the same proof text to understand their place in that narrative, and at the same time they drew very different conclusions, and those differences, I believe, have significant consequences for how we interpret both these movements. So to proceed, what I'll do is give some background on the siege of Mecca. What was it? Who carried it out? I'll go over the group's beliefs in some, hopefully not too mind-numbing detail, particularly its understanding of end times. And I'll put this in comparison with ISIS's apocalyptic vision, such as I understand it. Just to explain kind of where I'm coming from, there's been some scholarship on this movement, but they're not very much. Recently, 2 scholars spent some time in Saudi Arabia and interviewed some of the former members of this group that besieged Mecca in 1979. But one thing that they don't do, and that other scholars haven't done carefully, is to look at the actual sources in Arabic that the group was publishing in the months leading up to its siege, which are incredible. They're quite difficult to read, though, if you're not terribly familiar with this theological tradition or with apocalypticism. So this is, just to give you a sense, this is what the State Department in Kuwait, this is from a declassified cable that they wrote back to Washington in December 1979. This is what they said about these documents that I've read. They said that they're more than expressions of religious zealotry. However, we find them to be so larded with obscure theological references that even had we had time and resources to attempt a full and scholarly translation, we would not wish to do so. So basically you have this enormous group of texts, there are 13 texts that have been, some of them were published by a kind of crazy Egyptian liberal guy who sort of Baudelarized them and put them in the wrong order. But they haven't really been studied in English, and so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I've read them quite carefully. They're actually all at Exeter University Library is where I found them somehow. That's the only place I've been able to locate them, so I have all the originals. So first, the siege of Mecca, what happened? It was the first day of the 15th Islamic century, that is the year 1400 Hijrah, which corresponds to November 20th, 1979. It was then that about 200 armed men, led by one Juhayman al-Utaybi, they took control of the Grand Mosque with guns. At the time, a lot of people were very confused. What is this group? It was happening around the time of the Iranian Revolution, so there were people who thought, oh, this is another manifestation of Islamic revolution. There were, a lot of people today still think that it was basically sort of a revolutionary movement, but in fact it was not. It was, I can say with perfect certainty that it was driven by apocalyptic convictions. What happened is that the militants, they took hostage tens of thousands of worshippers, and they anointed one of their own, a certain Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Qahtani, as the Mahdi, who I would call in Arabic translation the guided one. They believed that the end of the world was nigh, and so certain were they that they actually only brought a week's worth of provisions for their siege. They had stored things in the mosque, in the catacombs of the mosque in the weeks leading up to the siege. And so to those who think that this was actually, that they had secular ambitions, well, they only stored a week's worth of supplies. So, they were, and this really hurt them when they were, when the siege started and the Saudi authorities started trying to take it over. The militants, once they got control of the mosque, they took over its PA system to explain what they were doing. And they began reading 7 hadiths, or statements attributed to the Prophet, and all concerning the Mahdi. And they were trying to prove that their friend, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Qahtani, was this man. So the hadiths had it that the Mahdi would have, quote, a broad forehead and prominent nose, that he would be of the Prophet's tribe of Quraysh, in particular the line of Fatima, that his name would be identical to the Prophet's name, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, that he would seek refuge in the holy sanctuary in Mecca and be given bay'ah, the traditional contract of rule in Islam between the Kaaba and al-Maqam, or the rukn of the Kaaba, meaning the corner of the big black box in Mecca, and something called the Station of Abraham. And so that's what was going on. Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Qahtani, they said, met all of these conditions, and he was being given bay'ah. The speaker also explained that there had been a number of dreams, between 20 and 50, by multiple members of Juhayman's group who had confirmed the Mahdi's identity and the date of his anointment. So while there is a hadith that says that there will be a renewer every 100 years in Islam, this doesn't seem to be the main motivation behind the mosque seizure. Of course, as in most of these types of movements, things didn't go according to plan. Within 4 days, the Mahdi had been shot and was dead. But the siege continued for 2 weeks, and the authorities, the Saudis, with the help of French special forces, were able to take it back. Hundreds of people were killed, and justice, Saudi style, was nice and swift. In January, 63 members of the group were taken out in the public squares of 8 different cities in Saudi Arabia and beheaded publicly. So that's the story of the mosque incident. How did it happen? How did the group come to believe with certainty that it was here giving bay'ah to their Mahdi and triggering the apocalypse? Well, it wasn't inevitable, essentially. The group did not begin as a messianic cult. JSM was originally nothing but a scholarly organization based in Medina and the Hijaz of Saudi Arabia. It was founded in 1965 with the central aim of really studying religion and preaching. and rural areas. It had been backed originally by the Saudi religious establishment, particularly Sheikh Ibn Baz. Demographically, most members belonged to sort of the disinherited tribes of the Saudi state that had fought a war in the 1920s with the Saudis, basically disagreeing with them on ideology. Its hundreds of members were devoted to Salafism or Wahhabism, this is JSM, and particularly to the study of hadith. Juhayman al-Utaybi, the leader of the siege, and who was the author of the group's literature, most of its literature, was one of the group's founders in 1965, and he wasn't a very learned person. He was a former truck driver in the Saudi National Guard and could really barely write, but he had apparently unbelievable charisma. In 1977, there was a split in this group, with some leaving in light of Juhayman's growing authority and assertiveness. Juhayman became outspoken in his criticism of the Saudis. He considered the regime to be lacking for piety, and soon there was a security crackdown, and Juhayman and certain members escaped into the desert, and they were not seen again until the siege of Mecca. In the desert, though, they began publishing essays about theology and politics, the ones that I mentioned that I got the original copies of before. It's kind of interesting that they found a left-wing publishing house called the Taliya in Kuwait to publish their works for basically free. The publishing house had no idea that this was like an Islamic movement. They thought, oh, this is just an anti-Saudi movement. We'll publish your works for free. Some of these essays set out a political philosophy. In Juhayman's opinion, the Saudi regime was too close to the kuffar, or to the unbelievers. The rulers themselves, Juhayman actually did not accuse of being unbelievers, so he didn't pronounce takfir on the rulers. But he did argue that it was wrong to heed their rule, that it was wrong to give them bay'ah. This was for several reasons. First of all, he said because the Saudis are not of the tribe of the Prophet, they're not of Quraysh, and they don't engage in al-wala wal-bara. They don't engage in exclusive association with Muslims and dissociation from other Muslims, which amounts to fighting them or waging jihad against them. Rather, he says that the Saudis were destroying Islam and making war on the religion. But instead of proceeding to rebellion from these positions, which would be something that one might expect them to do, they went in a whole other direction entirely. This is because of the apocalyptic ideas that Juhayman began developing when he was in the desert. These ideas were set out very plainly in an essay that he wrote and published some months before the November siege. His essay, according to him, was the product of 8 years of study. It was titled Al-Fitan wal-Akhbar al-Mahdi wal-Dajjal wal-Nuzul Isa wa Ashrat al-Sa'a, the tribulations and the prophetic reports about the Mahdi, the Antichrist, and the arrival of Jesus and the portents of the hour. It's like a mouthful. So in this essay, Juhayman cites and arranges all the important hadith related to end times, and from this scriptural corpus, he culls an apocalyptic narrative, and he fits contemporary historical events into this narrative explicitly. And that's the most interesting part, is that he doesn't just bring a narrative together, this is what's going to happen. He says that, this figure that is mentioned in this hadith, oh, that's like King Abdulaziz. So let me give you this narrative in short form, as basically this is just, I'm paraphrasing his work. It starts this: there will be a Mahdi, a righteous man from among the Prophet's community, who will fill the world with justice after it was filled with oppression and darkness. The man will have the Prophet's name. He will be of Quraysh, from the line of Fatima. After being anointed in Mecca, this man will be on the earth for 7 years. The Mahdi is only going to be around for 7 years. When he is anointed, an army from the north will come southwards to Mecca to fight him, but that army will be swallowed up in the desert of Medina. Then there will be a sort of truce between the Muslims and the Christians, but the Christians will violate the truce and attack the Muslims. Then the Mahdi will lead a Muslim army to fight the Christians, who number 960,000. This is where Dabiq is mentioned as the possible site of a big battle. The Muslims will, of course, win, then conquer Constantinople. After this, the Antichrist, or El-Dajjal, which really kind of means deceiver, He will descend in the east, in Khurasan, and chase the Mahdi to Jerusalem. Then Jesus will descend from the white minaret in Damascus and make his way to Jerusalem, pray behind the Mahdi, kill the Antichrist by the Lawed Gate in Jerusalem, and proceed to reign for 40 days, with time functioning differently. And then Jesus will fight and defeat Gog and Magog, and the day of judgment will be upon us. You can imagine what the State Department thought when they read that. This is not relevant, right? And it's a little bit mind-boggling to think that they actually believed that this was about to happen, but they really, truly did. So that's his short narrative. How did Juhayman kind of fit himself into it? Why did he start to believe that this was all about to happen? I think that the key is a certain prophetic hadith that is attributed to of course, a statement attributed to the Prophet, in which the Prophet describes 3 so-called tribulations, or fitan. And this is something, I hate to bore you with details, but I have to kind of give you the gist of the hadith in order to see exactly how this man was interpreting Scripture. And then it'll give you kind of a good perspective on how ISIS does the same thing, but to a lesser extent. So the tribulations mentioned in this hadith are 3. There's the tribulation of the saddle blankets, fitnat al-ahlas, the tribulation of abundance, fitnat al-sarra, and the tribulation of darkness, fitnat al-duhayman. And these are 3 kind of major challenges that the Muslim community is going to face and confront before the arrival of the Dajjal, or the Antichrist, according to the hadith. So the tribulation of the saddle blankets, the Prophet says, is a period of loss and flight, of privation and dislocation. Whereas the tribulation of abundance, he says, is one that will be, well, it's abundant in the sense that there will be plenty, but it will also be led by a man from my family, I think min Ahl Bayti, who claims that he is my ally when in fact he isn't, because my allies are those who fear God. And after the tribulation of abundance, men will join around another leader in a way unbefitting. Then you have the tribulation of darkness, which the Prophet says no one of this community will escape without suffering a blow. And this will persist until such time as mankind is split into 2 camps, fustatain, the camp of belief and the camp of hypocrisy and unbelief. Okay, that's another mouthful, I apologize. But how does Juhayman interpret this? He says that the tribulation of the saddle blankets was the state of affairs in Arabia before the arrival of the Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, who became the Emir of Mecca in 1908. If you know the story of Lawrence of Arabia, this is the Sharif that Lawrence is trying to wage a war with on behalf of Arab nationalism. And it's all very confusing. Before that, according to Juhayman, Arabia was lawless and dangerous, as the hadith describes. So this first tribulation had happened. The second tribulation of abundance, says Juhayman, had also already happened. Juhayman says that this tribulation was led by the Sharif Hussein, who was distributing gold to the Bedouin, hence abundance. And this was a man, in accordance with the hadith, who is described as being of my family, but not really of me. So he's really trying to fit in historical characters into these hadith. And then this is followed, says Juhayman, by the tribulation of darkness, led by none other than King Abdulaziz, the founder of the Third Saudi State, which was announced as a kingdom in 1932. This is, Juhayman says, the leader around whom men gather in a way unbefitting. It was unbefitting because the king had perverted Islam by fighting Juhayman's descendants, his tribal descendants, and he was conciliating the infidels and the heretic Shia instead of fighting them, instead of waging jihad. And the kingdom had divided the Muslim community into 2 camps, fustatain. So the tribulation of darkness was ongoing, meaning that it was only a matter of time before we got to the Antichrist. Now, if you thought that that's a little bit of a stretch of an interpretation, so did a number of individuals who belonged to Juhayman's movement. And actually, Juhayman's group, when it started to have these very specific apocalyptic ideas, it lost a lot of its membership, who abandoned they abandoned Juhayman, and basically they adhered to the same philosophy, the same Salafi ideology, but they didn't think that this apocalyptic speculation was appropriate. One of these guys who left the group was the so-called poet of the group. He was called Sha'ir al-Ikhwan, a Yemeni named Ahmed ibn Hassan al-Mu'allim. He left and he went to Kuwait, where before November 1979 he wrote a refutation, actually, of Juhayman's book on the tribulations and of end times. He prefaces this with, I think, a very revealing line where he says, look, I'm going to say that your interpretation is false, but before I do, look, it's not like I'm saying I think the world's going to last hundreds of years. He says, I just don't think it's going to end with us. So, and then he goes into the details, and he says, look, there are a number of events that you're not accounting for in the hadith corpus. Other things have to happen before the arrival of the Mahdi. There are supposed to be black banners in the east, for example. Where are the black banners? I don't see any black banners. And he takes issue specifically with that reading of those three tribulations. He says the saddle blankets tribulation, okay, maybe that happened, but abundance, that doesn't sound like Arabia to me. And the tribulation of darkness, that can't be associated with the Saudis, because according to the hadith, this is supposed to be a period of unstable rule, and the Saudis have stable rule. So how are you reading it like this? You're forcing the hadith to mean something that they don't. Furthermore, he says the division of the community into two camps actually takes place after the Mahdi has come. So the rest of the story about Ahmed al-Mu'allim's treatise, whether or not this is true, has it that Ahmed al-Mu'allim sent this refutation of Juhayman to Juhayman in Arabia, but the messenger carrying the treatise was arrested on his way. And the jihadi Salafi thinker Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi says that really, therefore, the Saudis are responsible for the siege of Mecca because they arrested this good man who is going to correct Juhayman's minor error. Among many weird things that man says. So why is this relevant? Let me conclude by explaining. It's relevant for, I think, two reasons. The first is that in the intellectual genealogy of Sunni jihadism, some of Juhayman's ideas figure quite largely. Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri were not themselves heavily influenced by Juhayman, but the scholars of the movement very much were. In particular, the Jordanian-Palestinian guy born 1959 named Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who I mentioned before. Al-Maqdisi, who's today opposed to ISIS but loves Al-Qaeda, has been the most important thinker in the jihadi movement since the late 1980s. He hosts a website that functions as the kind of jihadi library of the movement, and before adopting his strict, violent jihadi positions, he had been a member of Juhayman's movement in its residual or remnant form in Kuwait in the 1980s. He read Juhayman, he liked Juhayman, he defends Juhayman, as I explained. Particularly, he likes his ideas about association, dissociation. He publishes Juhayman's works on his website. The one thing he really doesn't like about Juhayman is that he didn't say that the Saudis were infidels. He takes issue with that. He doesn't really mind that much that they killed hundreds of people at the mosque in Mecca. That's an oversight. This favorable impression of Juhayman is carried on today in ISIS. You see it in the names of Twitter profiles named Juhayman. And the Mufti of ISIS today, a Bahraini named Turki al-Bin Ali, who is a former student of al-Maqdisi's, he also quotes Juhayman favorably sometimes. This is from one of his books I was reading. He says of Juhayman, "May God accept him among the martyrs," which is a pretty uncritical judgment of the 1979 apocalyptic siege, mistake. So that's one, that Juhayman's ideas and legacy still figure. The other reason is that the Juhayman episode is relevant because it provides this useful perspective for understanding ISIS's apocalyptic vision. ISIS is, as I said at the beginning, it's more of a caliphate now movement than an apocalypse now movement, such as I understand it. These groups had the same apocalyptic narrative, but they saw themselves as being at different points within that narrative. And what can really illuminate the distinction is their reading of one other hadith. Sorry to afflict you with so much hadith. This hadith is very important because ISIS uses it all the time to explain why their caliphate is the last caliphate on earth. It says that following the death of the Prophet, there will be a, quote, caliphate on the prophetic methodology, khilafa ala minhaj an-nubuwah. That will be followed by mordacious or biting kingship, and then that will be followed by tyrannical kingship, to be followed finally again by a caliphate on the prophetic model. And so Juhayman has an interpretation of this which clearly overlooks the idea of establishing a kingdom on earth. He discusses this, but he's not emphatic about the need to restore the caliphate, whereas ISIS, on the other hand, sees this as this is the final caliphate that has to be restored before we get to the Mahdi. So for ISIS, there is still an undetermined period of kind of caliphal renewal that must precede the entire apocalyptic narrative that Juhayman spelled out and that I read to you. So that's the period that we're in here. So despite the talk about Dabiq being imminent, despite the talk of we're going to conquer Rome, I think that in ISIS's view, they don't see this as really going to happen tomorrow because the Mahdi has to come first. ISIS would have to anoint the Mahdi in Mecca, just as Juhayman did. I do believe that that's what they want to do and that they really hope that they'll do that, but I don't think that they probably will. To sum up then, a few lessons. What can this possibly tell us about ISIS? First, I think it says that, that narrative I read to you sounds very far-fetched, but these movements can in fact terminate in the way that Juhayman's movement did. The apocalypticism is literal and it can take over. Second, however, is that if the movement does become a kind of millennial cult, as Juhayman's did, some members will probably leave in the way that Ahmed al-Mu'allim left Juhayman's. And there will be divisions, there will be refutations, and this is something I don't see reading ISIS's literature. I don't see people accusing it of having an excessive zeal for the apocalypse. Third is that jihadis are probably quite aware of Juhayman's episode, and this might prevent them from undue speculation about exactly where they stand in terms of end times. Fourth, just to repeat, is that there is this difference between an apocalypse now movement and a caliphate now movement, and one really has to consider, will ISIS appoint a Mahdi at some time, or will it not? That's it. Thanks.